November rain in Boston doesn't fall. It comes in sideways, driving into a person's face, as though the city itself were trying to move someone off the spot where they stand. On the old cobblestone rise of Chestnut Street, in Beacon Hill, 3 black cars crawled up through the water, one behind the other. Their headlights swept across the black iron fence of number 41. Behind the thick glass on the second floor, candlelight spilled out warm and yellow, and the small sound of glasses touching drifted down into the street, the sound of people who have never once had to stand outside in the cold. A woman stood on the other side of the gate. She had no umbrella. Her gray sweater had taken on so much water it had changed color. Her hair was pasted flat against her temples, and in both arms she held a wooden case, worn soft at all 4 corners. The kind of case you cannot buy in a store, the kind that gets handed down. She reached for the keypad set into the stone pillar. 6 numbers. The same 6 numbers she had entered hundreds of times over 14 months, with fingertips calloused from piano wire, familiar enough that she never had to look. The light turned red. She entered them again, slower this time, more carefully, as though care could repair something that was already broken. The light stayed red. The small speaker on the pillar clicked once. Then a voice came through, an older man's voice, level, with every trace of feeling filed off it. Mr. Sheridan's instruction is that no one comes through tonight without his direct authorization, ma'am. She moved a little closer to the stone, as though those few inches could change anything. Mr. Ward, I only need to ask him one question. Just one. The silence on the other end lasted longer than it needed to. Long enough for her to understand that the man did not want to say the next part either. He said, "You've already said what you had to say." Behind her, car doors opened. 4 men in wool overcoats stepped out, turning their collars up against the wind, and then stopped, because on the screen set flush into the wall beside the gate, where the date and the outside temperature usually sat, a line of text had just lit up through the rain. ASHBYS. Excess. Revoked Tuesday, before dawn. Large enough to read from the street. Large enough that all 4 men read it, and then immediately found somewhere else to look. Before dawn. She turned the words over in her mind, and something inside her chest made a half-turn. Before dawn meant he hadn't slept. It meant he had lain there all night, in that high-ceilinged room with his eyes open and his hands resting on his chest. And then, while it was still dark, he had sat up, reached for the phone on the nightstand, and erased her. She lifted her head. On the 3rd floor, behind glass that no one in that house ever called by its proper name, a figure stood without moving. No light behind him, only a shape darker than the dark. Arms at his sides, face turned down. Cormac Sheridan looked at the woman standing outside his gate in the November rain, and he did not move once. 3 nights earlier she had stood in the drawing room directly beneath him and told him she had never loved him, that she had stayed because she needed time, and needed somewhere to pass through, that now she had enough. He believed her. In the world Cormac Sheridan was raised in, a person will lie about almost anything, except the things that cost them everything to say. So he did exactly what a man like him is taught to do before he is old enough to question it. He took it all back. The cards, the keys, the gate code, her name on the guest list. 3 short calls, in less time than it takes a cup of coffee to go cold, and not one raised voice in any of them. He had never needed to raise his voice. People did not fear Cormac Sheridan because he shouted. They feared him because he answered slowly. But there was one thing Cormac Sheridan did not know, and he would not know it for another 4 months. Every word she said to him that night had been written for her. She was only reciting. She had practiced the whole way home on the bus, mouthing it silently until her voice stopped shaking, because if she let a single beat of it slip, he would have known. And the woman who wrote those words was sitting in the dining room behind him at that very moment, a glass of red wine in her hand, smiling at her son's guests. As for Sloane Ashby, standing outside a locked gate in the rain, she had not come to take anything back. Not the cards, not the house, not him. She had come to ask one question, and he would never give her the chance to ask it. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with Sloane. 14 months before that rain, on a Thursday evening in the North End, the dining room at Corvy's was doing what it did best, which was to make people believe that money had manners, white cloths pressed to the edge of stiffness, waiters who moved like they were carrying something more fragile than plates, wine poured at the shoulder, never reached for. It was the kind of room where a man could sit down heavy with debt and stand up an hour later, feeling like a person of standing again. And that was precisely why Barrett Doyle had chosen it. He had filed his papers 11 days earlier. He had stood in front of a bankruptcy trustee and said the word nothing 4 separate times, in 4 slightly different ways, and every one of them had been accepted. Now he was eating veal with his wife Lorraine and telling her, in the low, confidential tone men use when they are describing a storm they have already survived, that the worst of it was behind them. Lorraine was listening the way wives listen when they have been married 30 years and have learned to tell the difference between a man who is calm and a man who is performing calm. She saw the door before he did. She saw the room change temperature before he did. A young man in a wool coat had come in from Hanover Street without giving his name to the host, and the host had not asked for it, and that alone should have told Barrett Doyle everything he needed to know about the evening. Cormac Sheridan crossed the floor without hurrying. He did not scan the room. He did not look for the table. He walked directly to it the way a man walks toward a chair in his own kitchen. And when he arrived, he took the empty seat across from Lorraine and pulled it in and sat. And he did this without asking, without apology, without so much as glancing at Barrett Doyle's face to see how it was landing. He put his hands on the table. They were clean hands, unremarkable, the hands of an architect or a surgeon or a man who signed things. On his left wrist was a watch that had belonged to his father, the only object he owned that could be described as sentimental. And it was scratched in a way expensive watches usually are not. He said good evening to Lorraine. He said it kindly, and he used her first name. And that was the moment Barrett Doyle stopped chewing. Nobody in the room was looking at them. Everybody in the room was looking at them. That was the particular arithmetic of a place like Corvy's, where the staff had learned to develop a sudden interest in the far wall, and the tables nearby had learned to lean in toward their own conversations, with a concentration that fooled no one. A waiter turned back toward the kitchen with a bottle he had not opened. Cormac reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out a single folded sheet of paper. He did not slap it down. He did not push it across the linen with 2 fingers the way men do in films when they want a gesture to be seen. He unfolded it, smoothed the crease flat with the side of his palm, and set it beside Barrett Doyle's plate, as though he were returning something the man had dropped on his way in. It was a property transfer. A small colonial in Medford with a green door, deeded out of Barrett Doyle's name and into his sister's, signed and notarized and recorded 6 weeks before the bankruptcy filing. His late mother's house, the last thing left of her, the one asset he had moved quietly, in the dark, believing that quietly and in the dark were the same thing as safely. Lorraine looked at the paper, then she looked at her husband, and something in her face closed like a door. Barrett Doyle opened his mouth. He got as far as an intake of breath. Cormac lifted one hand slightly off the tablecloth, no more than an inch, and the breath stopped where it was. He spoke then, and his voice was so low and so even that Lorraine had to lean forward to catch it, and what he said was this: "I am not taking your mother's house. I only wanted you to know that I found it before the court did. That was all." He did not name a figure. He did not set a deadline. He did not say what would happen next, because the entire architecture of the thing depended on Barrett Doyle spending the coming nights building that part himself, in the dark, with better materials than Cormac could have supplied. He pushed his chair back, stood, and buttoned his coat. He wished Lorraine a good evening a second time, and he meant it, and that was somehow the worst part. Then he walked out through the room without touching anything, and his plate was never brought, and Barrett Doyle's veal went cold in front of him at a rate that seemed suddenly very rapid. On the sidewalk, Dermot Quinlan was already at the car with the rear door open, one hand on the frame, rain beating on the shoulders of his jacket. He had been standing there long enough to be wet. He asked nothing. He had worked for the family for 19 years, and had learned early that the questions a man does not ask are the reason he keeps being trusted with the answers. Cormac got in. The door shut. Inside Corvy's, the room let out a breath it had been holding without knowing it, and conversation resumed at a volume slightly higher than before, the way it does after a near miss on a highway. Barrett Doyle paid his debt within the week, in full, without a single call being made to him, because that was the method, and the method never varied. Cormac Sheridan did not threaten people. He simply arranged, with great care and no cruelty that could be pointed to afterward, for them to understand that they were being watched, and then he left them alone with that knowledge and let it do the work. It was efficient. It was clean. It had never once failed him, and in 14 months it would cost him the only thing he had that could not be repossessed. 4 miles south of the North End, On that same Thursday evening, in a parish hall in Dorchester, where the radiators had been shut off since October to save on the oil bill, a woman was on her knees under an upright piano with her sleeves pushed to the elbow. St. Brendan's had been built when the neighborhood was full of dock workers, and it had the bones of that era: high windows, wide plank floors, a ceiling that carried sound beautifully, and carried cold just as well. Sloane Ashby had been there since the choir let out. She had her tuning hammer in one hand, and a felt mute strip laid across her knee, and every few minutes she stopped, brought both hands up to her mouth, and breathed into them until the feeling came back to her fingertips, because cold fingers cannot hear. That was the part nobody outside the trade ever understood. A tuner does not work with the ears alone. The information comes up through the hammer, through the wrist, through the pads of the fingers, in vibrations too small to name, and if a hand goes numb, it goes deaf. So she warmed them and set them back on the wire and listened to the fifth she had just narrowed, and she narrowed it again by an amount that could not have been measured by any instrument in that building. The piano was 90 years old and had been donated by a family who no longer had anyone left to play it. The soundboard had a crack she had been managing for 2 winters, the way a person manages a bad knee, and the bass strings were long past the point where new ones would have been the honest answer. She was not fixing it. She was negotiating with it. Father Emmett Boland came in from the sacristy with his coat already on and stood at a polite distance with his hands folded, the way men stand when they have to say something about money to someone who has already done the work. He started twice. He said the parish council had met, and that the discretionary fund was where it was, and that he had hoped to have better news for her this month. She did not look up from the keys. She told him she had known that when she took the call in September, and that it had not changed her mind then, and had not changed it now, and would he please stop looking at her like a man about to apologize for the weather. He laughed, because she had given him a way out, and he was grateful for it, and he told her the choir sounded like a different choir since she had started coming, and she said that was the piano and not her, and both of them let that be the end of it. She packed her tools by feel. The wooden case had belonged to her father, and it closed with a brass latch that had to be lifted and pressed at the same time, a trick nobody else in the world could do on the first try, and the 4 corners of it had gone soft and rounded from 30 years of being carried. She caught the last bus on Dorchester Avenue with the case flat across her thighs and both arms over it, the way a person holds something that would be very difficult to replace. The windows had gone to fog. She wiped a circle with the heel of her hand and watched the triple-deckers slide past, lit yellow, laundry still out on some of the back porches, and she did the arithmetic she did every night on the ride home, which was not really arithmetic at all, but a kind of prayer with numbers in it. Her phone rang somewhere past Field's Corner. The screen said Quincy, and the sight of that word still did something to the base of her throat every single time, even after 2 years of it. It was the night aide, apologetic, saying her mother was up and wanted the phone. Then Bertie was on the line, and Bertie's voice was bright and completely ordinary, the voice of a woman standing in a kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder. She wanted to know what time school let out. She wanted to know whether Sloane was coming straight home after or going to Denise's first, because if she was going to Denise's, she should call, and last time she had not called. Sloane closed her eyes and put her forehead against the cold glass of the bus window. Then she said not to hold dinner, that she would be late tonight, and that her mother should go on and eat. Bertie said that was fine, that she would leave a plate in the oven, and she said it in a voice with no worry in it at all. Then she was gone, and the aide came back on, and said she had settled right down, and that she always did after she talked to her. Sloane said thank you. She stayed on the bus 3 stops past her own, because she was not ready yet, and then she walked back in the cold with the case in both arms. And in Beacon Hill that same night, in a study on the 3rd floor where a single lamp was burning, Cormac Sheridan poured 2 fingers of whiskey he did not drink, and said, almost as an afterthought, that there was a tuner who came to the Kingsbury, a woman. She had been in on Tuesday. He wanted to know about her. Dermot Quinlan, standing in the doorway with his coat over his arm, asked how far. Cormac did not look up from the window. All of it, he said. The Kingsbury sat on the water side of Atlantic Avenue and had been built as a customs house before it was anything else, and the lobby still carried that in its proportions, too tall for comfort, all marble and cold light, a room designed to make a person feel small before they were asked for anything. Cormac Sheridan had owned it for 6 years and had changed almost nothing about it, which the general manager privately considered a failure of imagination, and which was, in fact, the only opinion Cormac held about the building. In the far corner, under a window that ran nearly floor to ceiling, stood a concert grand that had come with the property. Guests photographed it. Nobody played it. On the Tuesday in question, a woman had been let in through the service entrance at an hour when the lobby was empty, and by the time Cormac came down the stairs, she had the lid up and the fallboard off, and her tools laid out on a cloth on the floor, in an order that clearly meant something to her. She had her back to him. She was talking, not to him, because she did not know he was there, but to the instrument, in the flat, unembarrassed way of a person who has spent a great many hours alone with objects. He stopped near the base of the stairs and listened to her strike the same note 11 times. He said, when she finally paused, that he had been told the thing was ruined. She answered without turning around, which nobody in that building had done in 6 years. "This piano is not ruined," she said. "It has only been neglected." Then she did turn, and she looked at him without any of the small adjustments people made when they learned who he was, because she had not learned. She saw a man in a dark coat with his hands in his pockets. She told him somebody had been opening that window all winter, that the room had been swinging 30 degrees and back again for months, and that a soundboard cannot be asked to live through that and still hold a pitch. She said it the way a physician says a thing to a family member who has not been paying attention. He asked whether she could fix it. She said that anything can be fixed, if somebody is willing to listen to it complain first. Then she went back to work and forgot about him entirely, and that, more than the sentence itself, was what kept him standing there. He did not sit down. He stayed where he was, at the foot of the stairs with his coat still on, and he watched her work for close to 2 hours. She unisoned the middle first and left the base for last. She stopped to warm her hands twice. At one point she took a felt punching out of her pocket and shimmed a key that had been running shallow, and she did it in less time than it took him to notice she had done it, and she never once looked up to see whether anyone was impressed. There was no performance in her at all. He had spent his adult life in rooms where every gesture was aimed at somebody, where a man could not pour a glass of water without it meaning something to the person across the table, and here was a woman on her knees, on a marble floor, doing careful work that would be noticed by nobody, for a client who would never know her name, in a building she had no idea belonged to the man watching her. When she was finished, she closed the lid and ran a scale with her right hand, and the room, which was a terrible room for music, and always had been, gave it back to her, sounding almost forgiving. She packed the wooden case, worked the brass latch with both thumbs, and let herself out the way she had come in. He never said another word to her that night. On the 3rd floor, behind the glass, the man remembered those hands. He remembered how cold they had been the first time he touched them. He could not remember the last time he had asked her whether she was cold. She came through the gate for the first time on a Friday in March, 5 months after the Kingsbury, with a canvas bag over one shoulder, and her hair still damp from the walk up the hill. The house was narrower than it looked from the street, and went back much further than a person expected, and the first thing she noticed was the quiet, not the absence of noise, but the specific quality of it, the way a house sounds when it has been kept by the same hands for a very long time. Otis Ward took her coat. He was a tall man, gone slightly stooped, 60-something, in a gray cardigan with the sleeves pushed to the forearm, and he had a way of putting things down that made no sound at all. He showed her where the kitchen was, and the back stair, and the door to the garden that stuck in wet weather, and then he walked her to the front, and stood with her in the entry, and said there was one thing he told everybody. Nobody came through that gate without Mr. Sheridan's word on it. Not a delivery, not a friend, not family. He said it pleasantly, the way a man recites a house rule about shoes, and then he added that it had been that way under Mr. Sheridan's father, and under his father before him, and that in 3 generations nobody had ever gone around it. Sloane said she understood, and thought no more about it than she thought about the umbrella stand. In the front room there was a fire laid but not lit, and a mantel of dark stone, and on the mantel, set among a clock and 2 candlesticks, lay a small silver frame face down on the marble. She reached for it without thinking, the way anyone reaches for a picture that has fallen over, and Otis was there before her hand closed on it. He did not take it from her. He simply put 2 fingers on the edge of the frame and said, in the mildest voice imaginable, that they left that one as it was. She drew her hand back and apologized, and he told her there was nothing to apologize for, and offered her tea, and that was the whole of it. Later in the afternoon, the bell went at the front, and she heard Otis cross the hall, and a man came in from the street, not a young man, in a work jacket with rain on the shoulders. He did not take his cap off and he did not sit. He set an envelope on the console table by the door, said good afternoon to nobody in particular, and went back out. 20 minutes after that, it happened again with a different man, and again before the light went. Sloane was in the front room with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, and she watched the third one leave, and she did not ask a single question. Not that day. Not the following Friday, when the same thing happened at the same hour, and not any Friday in the 14 months that came after. It was not that she suspected nothing. It was that she had grown up in a house where money arrived in ways nobody discussed, and had learned young that the fastest way to lose your place in a room is to ask it to explain itself. That evening, Cormac gave her a set of keys, a fob for the garage, the 6 numbers for the gate, and a black card with her own name printed across the bottom of it, which he had ordered without telling her. He put all of it on the table in front of her at once, the way a man does when he has been carrying an idea around for a while and wants it over with. She thanked him. She turned each thing over once, and then she carried them upstairs and put them in the second drawer of the dressing table, under a folded scarf, and left them there. He found out 3 weeks later when he needed the garage fob and went looking. He stood in the doorway holding it and told her she was the only person alive who could be handed a safe and decide to keep gloves in it. She said the gloves had to go somewhere. He laughed for longer than the joke deserved and did not think about it again for over a year. On the 3rd floor, behind the glass, the man thought about a drawer he had not opened in 3 days. He knew what was in it. He had known for some time and had told himself it meant nothing. The dinner was set for a Sunday in June, and Sloane spent most of the preceding week quietly terrified of it, which she did not tell anyone, least of all Cormac, who had presented the whole thing as though it were nothing more than a meal. She wore green because Otis had said, in passing, with his eyes on the silver he was polishing, that Mrs. Sheridan had always liked green on people. Rosalind Sheridan met her in the hall and took both her hands and said her name as though she had been waiting a long while to say it out loud, and any picture Sloane had built in her head of a cold woman in pearls collapsed inside of 4 seconds. She was warm. That was the thing nobody ever believed afterward, and it was the truest thing about her. She was 68 and beautiful in the way certain women stay beautiful, by deciding to, and she had a voice pitched low and unhurried, a voice that made whoever she was speaking to feel like the only serious person in the room. She asked about the hall in Dorchester. She asked what a soundboard actually was and then listened to the entire answer without her eyes moving once. At the table, she sat Sloane on her right rather than across, which meant they spoke to each other for most of the evening at a distance of 18 inches. And Cormac, 4 seats down, watched his mother laugh twice at something Sloane had said, and felt a kind of relief he would have been embarrassed to name. Fintan Sheridan was at the head in his chair. The stroke had taken his speech 4 years earlier, and left almost everything else, and he sat through dinner with a napkin tucked at his collar and one hand curled in his lap, following the conversation with the concentrated attention of a man who has learned that listening is now the whole of his participation. Otis served. The room was gold with the last of the long summer light. Somewhere past the fish course, Rosalind refilled Sloane's tea herself instead of letting Otis do it, and leaned in slightly and asked about her people. It was asked the way an aunt asks. Where had she grown up? Milton, Sloane said, then Quincy after, and her mother. Sloane hesitated, and Rosalind waited without filling the silence, which is a very particular skill. And then Sloane told her about the memory unit, and about the Sunday visits, and about the piano in the day room, and Rosalind put down her cup and said that her own mother had gone the same way, at the end, and that there was a specific loneliness in being remembered on some days, and not others that nobody who had not done it could understand. Sloane's eyes went, briefly. Rosalind pretended not to see it, which was a kindness, and asked about her father instead. He had been a carpenter, Sloane said. Finish work, mostly. Stairs and floors and built-ins. The sort of thing that took twice as long as anybody wanted to pay for. He had died when she was 19. Rosalind asked whether he had left them anything, and Sloane laughed a little. And here is where it happened. Here is where she made the only mistake she ever made in that house, and she made it because she was warm and grateful, and wanted very badly to be the kind of person who did not hide things from the family she was marrying into. She said he had left them a debt. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. She explained that there had been an accident on a job when she was in high school. A fall, no insurance, and that the medical side of it had been settled somehow, but the rest of it had not, and that there had been borrowing after that, and borrowing on top of the borrowing, and that by the time he died, there was a judgment in Norfolk County against the estate for a little over $211,000. She named the court. She named the year. She said she had been paying against it since she was 22, that she had gotten it down under 160, and that she expected to be paying against it for a good part of her life, and she said all of this with her chin up, because she was not ashamed of her father and did not intend to sit at that table and act as though she were. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and put her hand on top of Sloane's on the tablecloth and left it there, and said that she thought that was one of the braver things she had heard anyone say at that table in a very long time, and that she hoped Sloane understood she was not required to carry it alone anymore. Sloane could not answer. She nodded and looked at her plate, and Rosalind squeezed her hand once, and then let go and asked Otis about the raspberries. And the conversation moved on, and it was the happiest Sloane had felt in perhaps 8 years. Down at the head of the table, Finton Sheridan had not touched his food. He had been watching her the entire time she was speaking, and when she finished, he went on watching her for several seconds longer, and then he turned his head slowly and looked at the mantel, where a small silver frame lay face down on the stone. Nobody noticed. The light went orange, then blue. Cormac walked her out to the car at the end of the evening, and said his mother had liked her, and Sloane said she knew, and neither of them said anything else about it, because there was nothing else that needed saying. He asked her in the parish hall at St. Brendan's on a Tuesday afternoon in September, which she never stopped finding funny afterward, because there was not a single thing about the setting that a man in his position would have chosen on purpose. She was up to her wrists in the old upright with the felt strip in her teeth and dust on both forearms from the base section, and the light coming through the high windows was full of it, that slow gold drift of a room nobody has properly cleaned since the war. He had come to pick her up. He had been standing at the back by the folding chairs for a while, in a suit, out of place in every possible way. And she had told him not to touch anything, and he had said he would not dream of it. Then he walked up the aisle and stood at the end of the keyboard and said her name, and something in how he said it made her take the felt out of her mouth. He got as far as saying that he had been trying for 2 months to think of a way to ask her that would sound like it had been thought about, and that he had not managed it, and that he was going to ask anyway, and would she? She said yes before the sentence closed. He said he had not finished. She said she knew, and she was still holding the tuning hammer, and she did not put it down, and neither of them ever remembered afterward which one of them started laughing first. He drove her back over the bridge with the windows down. That night he brought her up to the 3rd floor, which she had been in perhaps twice, and turned off the lamp so the glass would stop reflecting them, and the whole of it opened up below, Beacon Hill falling away in slate and chimney pots, the harbor beyond it going black, the Longfellow strung out in lights, the planes coming down over the water in their slow, patient line. She stood with her palms flat against the glass like a child. He stood behind her, close but not touching, and after a while he said the thing he had come up there to say, which was that nobody could reach her here. Not anymore. She turned and looked at him, and understood that he meant it as the largest gift he had. She said thank you, because there was nothing else to say to a man who had just told you he intended to build a wall around your life, and because at that moment, with her hands cold from the glass and the city laid out underneath her, she wanted very much to believe it. Later, when she had gone down to bed, he sat at the desk in the study with a single lamp on and set up a standing payment to the memory unit in Quincy, monthly, indefinite, drawn on an account that had nothing to do with the family and everything to do with him. He did not tell her. He never intended to tell her. It was not a secret so much as a thing he saw no reason to say out loud, and if anyone had asked him why, he would have said that a gift a person has to thank you for is only half a gift. And he would have believed that, and he would have been wrong in a way that would take him 14 months and a locked gate to understand. Downstairs, Rosalind had said something at dinner that week about the vote. The papers were with the lawyers. Nobody knew when it would come, only that it was coming, and that when it came it would decide whether half of what the Sheridans owned could finally walk in daylight. On the 3rd floor, behind the glass, the man stood in exactly the place where he had told her nobody could reach her. He had been right about that. He had simply never considered that he might be the one who could not. The invitation came by telephone and was so ordinary that Sloane did not think about it twice. Rosalind knew a place on Newberry Street, below the sidewalk, 4 tables and a curtain, the kind of room that had existed in Back Bay since before either of them was born, and survived on people who wanted to talk without being seen doing it. She was already there when Sloane came down the steps out of the November cold, seated with her back to the wall and her coat still on, and she stood and kissed her cheek and said she had ordered for both of them because the woman who ran the place did not really believe in menus. They talked about nothing for a while. The wedding, which was to be small. The hall in Dorchester, where Father Boland had already asked whether the piano might be considered part of the arrangements. Rosalind laughed at that, and it was a real laugh, and Sloane felt the last of her guardedness go out of her the way it always did around this woman. Then the tea came, and Rosalind poured, and when she set the pot down, she did not pick her cup back up. She reached instead for the leather folio on the chair beside her, and she put the first thing on the table. It was a transfer authorization for the memory unit in Quincy. Bernadette Ashby, date of birth, resident since, moving to a state facility in Brockton, effective in 14 days, and it was signed at the bottom by somebody whose name Sloane did not recognize and dated the previous Thursday. Sloane looked at it for a long moment and then said she did not understand. And Rosalind said, gently, that she should read the letterhead. The trust that funded the private unit had 2 principal donors, and one of them was a Sheridan Foundation, and a foundation may direct its charitable placements as it sees fit. And that was the entire mechanism, and it took 11 seconds to explain. She let Sloane sit with it. Then she put the second thing down. It was a file, half an inch thick, tabbed. Sloane opened it and saw her father's name on the first page, and her hands went cold before she had read a line. It was the debt. It was the Norfolk County judgment, and the borrowing that preceded it, and the account histories underneath all of it. And someone had gone through the whole of it and drawn the connections in a fine legal hand. And what the connections showed was that during the 2 years before Dennis Ashby died, payments had moved between accounts controlled by the Sheridan family and accounts controlled by him. The amounts were there. The dates were there. Sloane said that could not be right, and Rosalind said that it was entirely right. That every figure in that file was accurate, and that accuracy was precisely what made it dangerous. She said the file did not accuse Sloane of anything. Sloane had been in high school. The file accused the family of moving money through a private tradesman with no business reason to receive it. And there was only one name on the family side of every one of those pages, because Finton had signed nothing in 4 years and Cormac had signed everything. Sloane heard a sound in her own ears like a room emptying. Then Rosalind put the third thing down, and the third thing was not a document at all but a sentence. She said the vote was coming. She said the filings were with counsel and had been for 8 months, and that when they cleared, every board member and every partner and 2 federal agencies would go through the family's holdings line by line, and that nobody on earth could tell her whether that was going to happen in 9 weeks or 9 days, and that this was the part she wanted Sloane to sit still and understand, because it meant there was no version of waiting. She said it without heat. She had not raised her voice once. She said that if Sloane went home tonight and told her son about this conversation, Sloane would not be saving him. She would be handing a prosecutor the thing they had been hunting for 6 years, and she would be doing it in his handwriting, and he would go to the wall for it smiling, because that was exactly the sort of man he was, and his mother knew it better than anyone alive. Sloane did not cry. She sat with her hands flat on the tablecloth on either side of the file, and she looked at Rosalind Sheridan for what felt to both of them like a very long time. Then she said she would do it. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. She said she would do whatever was being asked. But she wanted Rosalind to hear one thing first, and to hear it properly, and she waited until the older woman's eyes came up before she said it. She said that Rosalind was protecting her son from the only thing in his entire life that had never once asked him for anything. Something crossed Rosalind's face then. It was there and it was gone, and afterward Sloane could never decide what it had been. Then Rosalind opened the folio a second time and took out a single sheet of paper, unfolded it, and set it down in front of her, and said that it had to be tonight, and that it had to be final, and that there could be nothing in it he could come back and ask a question about. And she began to read aloud what Sloane was going to say. The bus went up Boylston, with the windows fogged over, and she did not clear a circle this time. She sat with her mouth moving, and no sound coming out of it, over and over, until the shape of the thing stopped belonging to anybody. Then she was in the front hall of number 41, with her hand flat on the drawing-room door, and she stood there long enough that Otis, crossing behind her with a tray, slowed and then decided not to speak. She got the door open eventually. Cormac was standing near the fireplace with his sleeves turned back and a folder of something under his arm, and he smiled when he saw her, which was the part she had not prepared for. She had prepared for everything else. She had not prepared for him to be glad she was home. She walked to the middle of the room, which she had decided on the bus that she would do, because the middle of a room has no furniture to hold on to, and she did not trust herself near anything she could grip. And then she said it. All of it. She had it exactly. Every clause in the order it had been given to her, and she delivered it in a voice that came out flatter than she had intended, so flat that it did not sound like an argument or a confession, but like a woman reading a docket. She did not blink. She had understood on the bus that blinking was the thing that would give her away, that a person telling the truth blinks and a person holding a stone in her mouth does not, and so she kept her eyes on a point just to the left of his collarbone, and she did not let them close, and by the end of it they were streaming from dryness, and she let them, because dry eyes look like cold eyes, and that was all right. Cormac did not move while she spoke. When she had been going about 30 seconds, he put his right hand on the back of the armchair beside him, and he left it there for the entire remainder of it, and the only thing in the room that changed at all was the tendons across the back of that hand. His face did nothing. Not shock, not anger, not the flicker of a man rearranging his understanding of his own life. He simply listened to her the way he listened to everyone, all the way to the end, without interrupting once, and the completeness of that attention was the cruelest thing that had ever been done to her. When she stopped, there was a silence in which she could hear the clock on the mantel. Then he asked her one question. He asked whether she wanted him to ask again. That was all of it. 8 words, and she understood exactly what she was being offered, because she had lived with him for 14 months and knew that this was the whole of his vocabulary for mercy, that this was Cormac Sheridan holding open the only door he knew how to hold open, and that behind it stood a version of the next 10 years in which she said the word yes, and he never once brought it up again. She wanted it so badly that her knees went. She said no. She said it quickly, before her voice could get involved, and she watched his hand come off the back of the chair and go into his pocket. And that was the moment it was finished, though neither of them said anything to mark it. She went upstairs and took 2 bags out of the closet, because she had decided on the bus that she would not take 3, and she left the black card and the fob and the keys where they had been under the folded scarf in the second drawer of the dressing table, and she did not open that drawer to check. On her way out, she stopped at the piano in the front room. It was a small parlor grand that nobody in that house played, and that she had voiced herself twice, for no reason except that it had been out, and she could not stand to leave a thing out. She took the ring off. It came off harder than she expected, over the knuckle, and she set it down on the closed lid, in the middle, where it could not be missed. Then she went out through the hall. Otis was at the front door, and he opened it for her, and she could not look at him. She got as far as the bottom of the steps before she heard it close behind her. In the study that night, Gideon Pratt sat with his chair turned toward the window and listened to the whole account without saying anything at all, and when it was over he asked whether Cormac was sure. Cormac said she had been extremely clear. Gideon looked at him for a moment. He was a man who had known him since they were 9 years old, and who had spent 20 years developing an ear for the specific ways his friend chose his words, and he heard, in the word clear, something he did not like the shape of. He waited a beat longer than the conversation called for. Then he said, "All right." And he let it go, and he would think about that pause every day for the next 4 months. The call came on the 3rd afternoon, while she was standing in the kitchen of a rented room in Roslindale that smelled like somebody else's cooking oil, and it was not the night aide this time, but a woman from the business office, apologetic in the specific way of people who have to deliver administrative news about somebody's mother. The account funding Bernadette Ashby's placement had been closed. Not lapsed, not declined, closed, on Tuesday. And the automatic monthly transfer that had cleared without interruption since the previous autumn had come back rejected. And while nobody wanted to rush anyone, the unit had a policy, and if the balance was not brought current, the resident would be moved to the state facility in Brockton. Sloane heard perhaps half of it. She was still back at the beginning of the sentence, at the part about the account, because she had never once in her life been told there was an account. She had been paying that bill, or she had believed she was paying that bill, which was not the same thing, and the difference between the two was opening underneath her, like a floor giving way. She had made a payment every month for 2 years. She had watched the number come out. What she had never done was look at what the number came out against, because the sum on the invoice had always been a sum she could survive, and a person carrying what she was carrying does not go looking for reasons to examine good news. She asked the woman to repeat the figure. She wrote it on the back of her hand with a ballpoint, because there was nothing else within reach. Then she thanked her, because she was the kind of person who thanked people and hung up and sat down on the back steps of the house in her coat, with the door open behind her and the cold coming up through the wood. She looked at the number on her hand. She did the arithmetic she had been doing on buses her entire adult life, and this time it would not go. She had the tuning work, which was seasonal and thin in winter. She had the church, which paid nothing. She had $411 in an account and a payment due against her father's judgment in 9 days. And no matter how she arranged those pieces, no matter which one she starved to feed another, the shape that came out at the end was the same shape, and it was Brockton. She sat there long enough that the light went. What kept turning over in her was not the money. It was Tuesday. She had walked out on Saturday night. Something had been closed on Tuesday, before dawn, and she did not need anyone to explain to her what a man like Cormac Sheridan did in the small hours when he had decided a thing was finished. He would have gone down the list. Cards, keys, codes, standing instructions, one after another, in the flat, efficient way he did everything. And somewhere in that list was a line he had put there himself more than a year ago, in the dark with a lamp on, a line he had never mentioned to a living soul, and it went with the rest of them. Nobody meant it. That was the truth of it, and it would stay the truth of it for 4 months. But Sloane did not know that, and could not have known it, because he had never told her the line existed, and what she was left holding on that step was a question with 2 answers, and no way to choose between them. Either the man she had spent 14 months with had been quietly keeping her mother in a bed with a window for a year, and had never once let her thank him for it, or he had reached into the only part of her life she could not defend, and taken it away 3 days after she hurt him. She had to know which. Not for the money. She was not going to ask him for the money, and she had already decided that before she stood up. She was going to ask him one question, and she was going to look at his face while he answered it. She washed the ink off her hand at the kitchen sink, put her coat back on, and went out to find the bus. She turned around. That was all. There was no moment of decision in it, no last look up, just a woman shifting her weight and turning her body a quarter turn to the left, and finding that her feet had already agreed to go. The wooden case went under her left arm. Her right hand went into her coat pocket, where it had been going all week without her permission, and closed around the thing she had been carrying there since Saturday. She had not meant to take it. She had put it on the piano lid and walked out, and gotten as far as the bottom of the front steps, and then she had gone back in and taken it, and she had never been able to explain that to herself in any way that made sense. It had lived in her pocket for 3 days. She had checked for it on the bus with 2 fingers, the way you check for a key. She stepped back toward the pillar, the one with the buttons on it, and there was a lip of granite below the bell, where rainwater had cut a shallow channel over 80 years, and she set the ring down in it. It did not roll. She stood there for a second with her hand still open above it. Then she took her hand back and walked down the hill. She did not run. The wet cobbles were treacherous on the incline, and she went carefully, with the case in both arms, past the parked cars and the black iron and the lit windows of houses where people were having ordinary Tuesdays, and at Charles Street she turned and was gone. Inside the gatehouse, Otis Ward stood at the window with his hands at his sides and watched the place where she had been for a good deal longer than there was any reason to. He had worked in that house for 22 years. He had let people in and kept people out, and had never once been asked to justify either. And he had gotten very good at the part of the job that involved not having a face. He had used that face on her tonight. He had listened to a woman ask him for one question, and he had said the words he had been given to say. And he had said them the way he had been trained to say them, level, with nothing in it, and then he had listened to her not argue. Nobody in the drawing room heard the front door. He went out bareheaded into the rain and down the walk, and stood at the pillar with his back to the house. The ring was where she had left it, sitting in its little channel of water, catching what light there was from the screen beside it. He picked it up. He turned it once between his thumb and forefinger, and there was nothing to see. It was a plain thing. She had asked for a plain thing. Then he put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, over his chest, and buttoned the jacket, and went back in, and dried his head with a towel in the pantry, and served coffee to 4 men in the dining room for another hour and 20 minutes, with his hands perfectly steady. He said nothing about it that night. He said nothing about it the following week, or the week after that, and he went on saying nothing about it for 4 months, and he could not have told anyone why, only that a man of 61, who has been in service since he was 19, develops certain instincts about which objects in a house are going to be needed again. Upstairs, the lamp in the third-floor study stayed on. It was still on when the guests left, and when the caterers finished, and when Otis went around at 2 doing the doors. It was on at 4. It was on when the sky over the harbor started to go the color of dishwater, and the man sitting under it had not turned a single page. He left the room alone for 11 days. Otis had offered twice to have it done, and had been told twice, politely, that it could wait. And then, on a Saturday morning, with nothing in the house, Cormac went up himself, with a box under his arm, because it had started to seem ridiculous. There was less than he expected. That was the first thing. 14 months of a life, and it came to a coat, some sweaters, a pair of boots, a shoebox of felt and wire and small brass things she had not needed at the church, and nothing at all in the way of jewelry or perfume or the accumulated sediment that people leave behind them. He worked through it without much feeling, which he noted and did not examine. Then he opened the second drawer of the dressing table to see whether it was empty, and found the scarf folded on top, and under the scarf, the keys, the garage fob, and the card. The card was still sealed. It was in the paper sleeve it had come in from the bank, with the little strip of adhesive across the flap unbroken, and the activation sticker still on the face of it, and her name printed along the bottom in raised silver letters. And he sat down on the edge of the bed holding it because his legs had made that decision independently. He went down to the garage. The car he had bought her was where it had always been, and the odometer read 408 miles. And 408 miles was what it had read on the day it was delivered, plus whatever the driver had put on it coming across the city. She had never once turned the key. He stood in the cold of that garage with his hand on the roof of a car she had never driven, and the whole of the last year began to reorganize itself in front of him with a kind of quiet horror, because he was a man who noticed everything, and he was realizing, 13 months late, what he had failed to notice. She had never asked. Not once. Not where the envelopes came from on Fridays. Not who the men in the work jackets were. Not why a property developer needed a house rule about a gate that had held for 3 generations. Not what he actually did. Not what any of it was worth. He had told himself for 14 months that this was tact. He understood now, standing in a garage, that it had also been the single most expensive thing anyone had ever refused to take from him. Gideon Pratt came by that afternoon because Cormac had asked him to and did not say why. He listened to the business about the drawer and the odometer, with his hands folded in his lap. And when it was finished, he did not offer comfort, which was not in him. And he did not offer analysis, which was. He asked one thing. He asked how long it had taken to erase her. Cormac said he did not follow. Gideon said he followed perfectly well, and repeated it more slowly. 3 calls, he said. It took 3 calls. Did any of the 3 go to her? Cormac did not answer, and Gideon did not push, and the silence sat between them in the study for a while like a 4th piece of furniture. The telephone rang after Gideon had gone. It was Camille Ashford, whom he had met twice in his life and did not particularly know, and who came at it directly, because she was as trapped as he was, and had less patience about it. Her father and his mother had been putting a dinner together. She had been told to keep the last Sunday of the month clear. She said she was not interested in embarrassing anybody, and she was not interested in marrying anybody either, and she thought he ought to know that the invitation to her people had gone out 3 weeks before the 2 of them separated. She said it once, did not repeat it, and got off the line. Cormac sat with the receiver in his hand for a moment. Then he went to the desk and opened the calendar he kept on paper, because he did not trust anything else, and counted backward, and counted again. 3 weeks before, he did not call Gideon. He called Dermot Quinlan and told him to pull the gate log for the entire autumn, every entry, every exit, and the driver's sheets for his mother's car going back 6 months, and to bring all of it to the house himself, and not to mention to anyone that he had been asked. The gate log and the driver's sheets took 8 days to arrive and told him almost nothing, which is to say they told him that his mother's car had made a great many trips that autumn to a great many ordinary places, and that a man could stare at a column of times and destinations until his eyes ached without any of it confessing. So he went at it from the other side. He had a simple premise, and he had held it since the night she walked out of the drawing room, which was that women do not stop loving a man over a weekend, and that when a thing changes that fast, somebody has paid for it to change. So he looked for the payment. He put 2 of Gideon's people on it quietly, and told them not to go anywhere near her personally, and what came back after 3 weeks was a single thread worth pulling. The building she worked out of in Somerville, the brick pile on Beacon Street across the line from Cambridge, where she rented the second floor for her bench and her string stock, was not owned by a bank or a family or anything with a face. It was owned through a holding company registered in Delaware and administered out of a mail drop in Providence, and rent receipts on the second floor had been credited against an account that had received 2 deposits in October from a source the researchers could not open. 2 deposits. October, the month before everything, and the name on the incorporation paper, sitting there at the bottom of the page like something left out for him, was Hollis Vance. Dermot brought the file up to the study himself. He stood while Cormac read it, and when Cormac closed the folder and said what he was going to do, Dermot did something he had not done in 19 years of working for that family, which was to disagree out loud. He said numbers do not say who did a thing. He said a shell company is a piece of paper, and a piece of paper will put any name on it that somebody hands it, and that he had gone and looked at the man himself, out of caution, and had watched him for 2 afternoons, and that Hollis Vance did not have the walk of a man taking money. He said it plainly, and then he stopped, because he had said his piece, and it was not his house. Cormac listened to all of it without interrupting. That was the terrible part, and it would remain the terrible part for the rest of his life. He listened. Then he said, to have it done by Friday. The office was on the ground floor at the back of the building, past the boiler room, and it had one window looking into an air shaft, and a filing system that had stopped being a system sometime during the Clinton administration. There was dust on the sill 1/8 of an inch deep, and a wall calendar 2 years out of date, and a framed photograph of a woman on a beach at Nahant that had faded to almost nothing. Hollis Vance was 66 years old and wore reading glasses pushed up into white hair, and he stood up when Cormac came in. Out of habit, the way men of that generation stand for anybody, Cormac did not sit. He set the papers down on the desk and squared them with 2 fingers, and he explained it in 4 sentences, without heat, in the voice he used for everything. The mortgage on the building had been sold. He had purchased the note. There was a technical default in the covenants that had been sitting there unenforced since '98, and it was going to be enforced now, and the timeline was 30 days. Then he said the sentence he had come to say. I am not buying your building. I bought its debt. The difference is that I do not need your permission. 30 years went out of the air in that room in less than a minute. Hollis Vance sat back down. He did not shout. He did not ask him to reconsider. He did not reach for the telephone, and he did not beg, and afterward Cormac would have given a great deal for him to have begged, because a man who begs is a man you can tell yourself something about. He took the glasses off his head and folded them and put them on the desk and looked at the papers for a while. Then he asked one question. He asked whether Cormac knew the name of the young woman who tuned pianos up on the second floor. Cormac said yes. Hollis nodded slowly, as though that answered a great deal and settled nothing. And he said, Then you ought to have asked her before you came and asked me. Cormac did not respond. He was already turning. He went out past the boiler room and up the stairs into the winter light on Beacon Street, and Dermot opened the car door and closed it after him, and did not say a word the whole way back over the bridge, and neither did he. The notice came taped to the door of the second floor on a Tuesday. 30 days, no negotiation, and by the end of the month there was a chain through the handles of the loading door on Beacon Street, and a sign in the window with a Providence telephone number on it. Sloane carried her string stock down 2 flights in 4 trips and put it in the basement of the house in Roslindale where it froze and was never any good again. She did not need anyone to explain to her what had happened. She had walked out of a house in Beacon Hill in November, and by February, the building she had worked in for 6 years was padlocked, and there was exactly one man in the world with the reach to do that and the reason to want to, and the fact that he had done it without ever calling her, without a word, without so much as coming to look at her while he did it, was somehow the part that took the skin off. She went and stood across the street from the building for a while on the last day. Then she went and found work. The cold storage terminal in the Marine Industrial Park took her on nights, 10 hours, 4 on and 2 off, moving palletized seafood between the freezer floor and the loading bays, and it paid better than the church, and better than tuning, and it was the only thing anybody had offered her. She wore 2 pairs of gloves and a rented parka, and she stopped playing anything at all, because after 10 hours in a room kept at 15 degrees below zero, a person's hands are not good for much beyond holding a cup. It was still not enough. In the second week of March, she took the wooden case down to a place on Dorchester Avenue that dealt in tools and estate lots, and she stood at the counter while a man went through it piece by piece with a loop, the levers and the mutes, and the temperament strips, and the 2 French files her father had bought used in 1986, and he gave her a number, and she took it. She kept one thing. She lifted the tuning hammer out before she pushed the case across the counter, and she put it in her coat pocket, and she left with it in there, and the money went to Quincy the same afternoon and bought her mother 11 more weeks in a bed, with a window. She never told anybody she had done that. Not one person. Ever. It happened on a night in April, and afterward she could only ever recall one detail of it, which was the sound of steel sliding on steel somewhere above her head. There was a pallet jack, and there was a rack, and there was a load that had been stacked by somebody on the shift before her, and the terminal filed an incident report that ran to 2 pages and settled nothing. The hospital in South Boston kept her 4 hours and told her nothing was broken. That was true. They gave her ice, and an anti-inflammatory, and a follow-up card, and told her to expect swelling for a week, and the swelling went down in 5 days, and she went back to work, and it was 2 weeks later, in the day room in Quincy on a Sunday, that she found out what had actually been taken from her. She sat down at the old spinet they kept against the wall, and put both hands on the keys the way she had put both hands on keys since she was 6 years old, and there was nothing in the last 2 fingers of her left hand. Not pain, not numbness exactly, just a flat silence where 40 years of information should have come up through the bone. The 2 fingers reporting back that they were touching something and declining to say what. She played a chord. She could feel the pressure, and not the surface. She could not have told you, with her eyes closed, whether she was on ivory or on the fallboard, and a tuner who cannot tell that is not a tuner, and she understood the entire remainder of her life in about 4 seconds, while sitting on a padded bench in a room that smelled of disinfectant and boiled carrots. She did not cry. There were 9 other people in that room, and one of them was her mother. She closed the left hand into a fist and put it in the pocket of her cardigan and left it there, and she started again with the right hand alone, playing the melody line of something old and slow, and it sounded thin without the bass under it, and nobody minded. Bertie clapped. She clapped in the wrong places, a half beat behind, the way she had for 2 years now, and when it was over, she leaned toward the aide beside her and said, in a bright, confiding voice, that the young lady played beautifully, and asked whether she came every week. They found her at the terminal in early May, which told her something about how long they had been looking, because there was nothing on paper anywhere that connected Sloane Ashby to a freezer floor in the Marine Industrial Park. There were 2 of them. The younger one stayed by the door with a folder he never opened. The one who did the talking was a woman of about 50 in a gray coat, who introduced herself as an assistant United States attorney, said her name twice so that Sloane would have it, and asked whether there was somewhere they could sit for 10 minutes. They sat in the break room among the vending machines with the fluorescent tube buzzing overhead and the smell of the microwave and everything. She did not begin with threats, which Sloane had half expected. She began with sympathy, which was worse. She said she knew about the building in Somerville. She said she knew about the judgment in Norfolk County, and the balance still outstanding on it. And she said the figure out loud, correct to the dollar, and let it sit there. She said she knew Bernadette Ashby's placement had come very close to being lost in the winter, and that these things had a way of coming close again. Then she laid it out. The government had been building something for 6 years, and had never once had a person inside that house who was willing to speak. Sloane had lived in it for 14 months. What she was being offered was not immunity, because Sloane had done nothing that required immunity. It was something better, and much rarer, which was help. Real help. The kind with a signature on it. The judgment could be made to go away, not reduced, gone. And there were victim and witness provisions that would cover residential care for a dependent parent, indefinitely, which in plain English meant that her mother would finish her life in the room with the window, and Sloane would never have to look at another invoice as long as she lived. She said all of it in a flat, professional way, without any pressure in her voice. And then she stopped and let the tube hum. Sloane sat very still. Her left hand was in her lap under the edge of the table, where it had been since she sat down, curled loosely, and she did not move it. She looked at the woman's coat. She looked at the vending machine. She thought about a man in a dusty office in Somerville, taking his glasses off his head and folding them, and about a locked gate in the rain, and about a great many other things that had nothing to do with any of it, and the 2 of them sat there while a forklift went past in the corridor outside. It took her close to a minute. Then she said she did not know anything. She said it quietly. She said she had tuned a piano in that house, and that was all she had ever done in it, and she was sorry that they had come all this way. The woman waited to see whether more was coming. Nothing more came. She left a card on the table and said that people's memories improved sometimes, and that hers would be at that number either way, and then the two of them went out through the swing doors into the yard, and the sound of the car faded off toward Summer Street. Sloane did not pick up the card. She sat where she was, in the same chair, with her hands in her lap, and the tube buzzed above her. And at 10 minutes to 11, the horn went for the start of the shift, and she got up and went to the freezer floor. The message reached her on a Thursday through a woman at the terminal office who had taken it off the phone and written it on the back of a receipt, and it said that there were documents concerning Bernadette Ashby's placement, that they were being held at a facility on the south side of the port, that it would be better if she came after hours, and it gave a shed number and a name she half recognized from a dinner table in June. Royce Sheridan. She should not have gone. She knew that walking out to the bus. She went anyway, because it was her mother, and because a person who has already lost the building and the hands and the case has a very particular relationship with risk. What she did not know was that the same information had been allowed to drift, carefully, along 2 separate channels, and had reached Beacon Hill within the hour, and that this had been the entire purpose of it. Royce did not want her. He wanted the man who would come for her, and he wanted him without Dermot Quinlan in the room. And he had calculated exactly right. Cormac was told at 9:30, and was on the Southeast Expressway by 9:45. He did not call Dermot. He did not call Gideon. He drove himself, alone, through the container yards with the rain coming across the sodium lights in sheets, past the stacked boxes standing 4 high in long black avenues, and he did the one thing that 3 generations of that family had agreed was never to be done under any circumstances, which was to walk into a room he had not had checked first. Shed 9 was open at the south end. Inside there were work lamps rigged off a portable transformer, and a forklift parked crooked with its engine running, and a folding table with 5 archive boxes stacked beside it, and Sloane standing near the table with her coat still buttoned and her arms at her sides, and Royce leaning against the forklift with a paper cup of coffee, 38 years old and smiling like a man at a wedding. He said he had not expected them both. Then he said several other things, some of them about the vote, and some of them about how long a man can stand behind another man's chair before he starts doing arithmetic. And while he talked, he was watching the door, and Cormac understood inside of 10 seconds that they were meant to still be standing there when somebody else arrived. He told Sloane to walk to the door. She got 4 steps. Royce put down the cup, swung himself into the seat, and pulled the lever, and the forks came up under the leg of a pallet rack that was carrying most of what that shed held, and the rack went over across the mouth of the aisle. Cormac had her by the arm before it came down and pulled her past him into the open, which put his own back into it. He did not go down. He got one hand flat against the wall of a container and stayed there, breathing in a way that came in pieces. And it was a while before he was able to straighten up all the way. Sloane had hold of his coat with both hands and was saying something he did not hear. Royce came down off the machine, and by then it had gone wrong for him in a way he did not yet perceive, because he was still looking at the boxes. Cormac looked at the boxes too. Then he laughed, once, without any humor in it at all, and told him to open one. Royce did not move. Cormac said it again. And eventually the older man walked over and lifted a lid and stood there with his hand on it. Every ledger in those 5 boxes was a decoy. Vinton Sheridan had built the practice in the early 1990s, and had never once explained it to anybody who had not been in the room when he built it. And the principle was that anything worth taking should have a convincing false version of itself sitting somewhere easier to find. There were 4 other sets like it in the city. Royce had come inside the family's confidence 11 years too late to have ever been told, and he had spent 7 months and a great deal of money assembling a case out of paper that had been manufactured to be assembled. He stood in the middle of that shed with the rain going on the roof, and nothing whatsoever left to trade. They did not talk about it in the car. Dermot had come out for them and drove, and he did not put the interior lights on, and the wipers went, and the harbor slid past on the left. Sloane sat in the back with him with both hands pressed flat against his ribs through the coat, the right hand and the left hand, the one that could feel what it was touching and the one that could not, and she kept them there over the bridge and up through the tunnel. Near the top of the hill he said she did not owe him anything for tonight. She said she knew. She said she had not been planning to pay him back either. Dermot Quinlan went into the Marlborough Street apartment on the Saturday with a locksmith and a key that was not his, and the safe behind the bedroom closet took the man 40 minutes. There was less in it than anybody expected. some bearer paper, a passport in a name that was almost his own, and a small digital recorder, the kind lawyers used to carry, with 11 files on it, and one of them dated the previous November. Dermot sat in the car outside with the thing in his hand and listened to the whole of it once, and then he did not listen to it again. And he drove it up the hill himself and put it on the desk in the study, and said only that Cormac should hear it alone. It was Royce who had made the recording. That was the thing. He had come to Rosalind Sheridan in the autumn, with the transfer authorization for the memory unit already signed and dated, handed it to her as a courtesy, as something she could use, and told her he would wait outside on Newbury Street. Then he had gone down the steps ahead of her, taken the table on the other side of the curtain, ordered coffee he did not drink, and put a recorder in his coat pocket. He had not done it to trap Sloane Ashby. Sloane Ashby was a girl who tuned pianos and was worth nothing to him. He had done it because a man who owns 40 minutes of Rosalind Sheridan's voice owns Rosalind Sheridan, and from that afternoon forward, the woman who had run that family from behind a chair for 30 years could not make a decision without looking sideways at her husband's nephew. The vote came 8 days after the shed. It had been 2 years in the building, and Rosalind had placed every piece of it herself. And the room they used was the long room on the ground floor, with the 12 chairs and the shutters closed. Cormac came in 11 minutes late. He did not apologize, and he did not sit down, and he did not say a single word to any of them. He put a telephone in the middle of the table and pressed it and stepped back. They listened to a woman being taken apart with great gentleness for a little over half an hour. And nobody in that room moved, and Rosalind sat with her hands folded and her chin level and her eyes on the middle distance, and did not once look at the table. And then it came to the part that no one had ever heard. Not the girl who had walked out of that tea room, not the man who had recorded it, because he had stopped listening by then, and had never played the end of it back. Rosalind's voice on the recording changed. It stopped. There was a long stretch of nothing, but the room tone of a basement on Newbury Street. And then she said, unsteadily, in a voice that did not belong to any version of her, that these men had met, that she had already lost one of them, and she was not going to lose the other. The recording ran on for another 9 seconds and ended. Royce came out of his chair and started talking about context, and about editing, and about the fact that anybody could put a device on a table, and Gideon Pratt, who had not spoken all morning, slid a folder down the length of it. Access records for the Norfolk County file, pulled twice in October from a terminal at a firm Royce retained. The incorporation paperwork for a Delaware holding company that owned a brick building in Somerville, with the beneficial ownership stripped back 3 layers to a single name, 2 telephone calls to a management office, and an electronic message to the administrative director of a memory care facility in Quincy, sent from Royce Sheridan's own account, requesting the transfer forms in advance. Cormac walked around the table. He did it slowly, the way he did everything, and he stopped 1 step short of where Royce was standing, and then he did nothing at all. He put his hands in his pockets. He stood there and looked at him, and the silence went on far past the point where it should have broken, and by the end of it there was not a man at that table breathing normally. Then he said that Royce had spent 7 months constructing a name to take responsibility for all of it, and that he had done it well, and that his only error had been in which name he chose. He did not turn him in. He never went to anybody, never made a call, never signed a statement. He simply stopped covering him. And the covering was the only thing that had ever kept Royce Sheridan's name off the paper, and every false ledger in 5 boxes had that name on it now, and the federal people who had been building for 6 years found it inside of a month. The room emptied slowly after that. Rosalind went out first and did not look at her son, and when there was nobody left but the 2 of them, Finton Sheridan, who had not spoken a word since the stroke, and who could get perhaps 4 letters onto a page before his hand gave out, pushed a scrap of notepaper across the table with the side of his fist. It had taken him the length of the meeting to write. There was 1 word on it. Emet. Cormac stood there with it. Then he went out into the front room and lifted the small silver frame off the mantel and set it upright on the stone, for the first time in 20 years. He found her at the house in Roslindale on a Thursday afternoon, and she opened the door with a dish towel in her hand, and he had barely gotten out that he had heard the recording before her whole face went. It was not grief. He had come across the city braced for grief, for tears, for the thing that happens when a person is finally allowed to put down what they have been carrying, and instead, what came at him from that doorway was raw animal panic. She said he was not supposed to know. She said it twice, and then she was asking him why he had gone digging, why he could not have let it alone. Why in the name of God he had needed the answer more than he had needed to be safe, and her voice was up in a register he had never heard from her in 14 months, because she was still holding the file in her head. She did not know that anything about it had changed. As far as Sloane Ashby understood the world at that moment, she had spent 6 months in a freezer and given up her father's tools and told a federal prosecutor she knew nothing, all of it to keep one stack of paper away from him, and now he was standing in her doorway telling her he had found it, and everything she had paid was money burned in a barrel. Gideon had opened that file the same week. He had gone at it with 2 accountants and a retired examiner, and it had taken them 9 days to find the thing that Royce had done, which was elegant and took almost no work at all, because he had not forged a single figure. Every payment in that file was real. Every date was real. He had simply reversed the direction of the arrow. The money had not gone from Fintan Sheridan into an account controlled by Dennis Ashby. It had gone out of Fintan Sheridan's own pocket toward the discharge of Dennis Ashby's debts, in 7 installments over 2 years, in amounts that never quite kept pace with what the man owed. And underneath that, in a folder of building records from 1996, was the reason. A Finnish carpenter had been contracted to rebuild the front stair and lay the floor of the drawing room at number 41. And in the 2nd month of the job, he had come off the staging in the stairwell, and he had been working without insurance, because men in that trade, in that decade, very often were. Fintan had paid the hospital. He had paid it in full, and had gone on quietly paying against the borrowing that followed for 2 more years, and he had never mentioned it to his wife, or to his son, or to the man himself in any way that required thanking. And then his hand had stopped working, and his speech had gone, and the whole of it had sat in a box in a warehouse for 20 years, waiting to be turned upside down and used as a weapon against his own child. Sloane sat down on the arm of a chair when Cormac told her. She said her father had said, once, that the debt got smaller sometimes and he did not know why. She said he had thought it was a clerical thing. She had been 15. Neither of them could speak for a while after that, because it meant the 2 families had already touched once, long before either of them was old enough to know it, and they had touched in exactly the way this entire story was made of, which is one person quietly paying for another and never once saying so. And that was the afternoon Otis Ward came, because Cormac had asked him to, and stood in that small front room with his hat in his hands, and told her about the invoices. The unit in Quincy had been paid every month since November, not by Cormac, whose line had gone with the rest of them and who had not thought of it again until that week, by Otis, out of his pension, and out of the sale of his late wife's ring, and out of weekend driving work he had picked up at 61 years of age and told nobody about. He would not sit down. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, and when Sloane asked him why, he was quiet long enough that they both understood the answer was going to cost him something. He said that 20 years ago his daughter had fallen in love with a man this family had not approved of. He said he had been instructed not to open the gate for her, and he said, without any self-pity in it at all, that he had obeyed the instruction, and that she had left Boston that spring and had never once called home. Then he said the thing he had come to say. He said he followed his orders at that gate, ma'am, but orders stop at the gate. It took him 20 years to learn that sentence, and he was not going to be taught it twice. They drove down to Quincy together on the Sunday. Sloane went in first, and was 3 steps into the day room before she registered that her mother had already looked past her, toward the doorway, and was smiling. And it was not the polite smile she gave the aides. Bertie said his name. She said it the way a woman says the name of someone she is glad to see, without hesitation, without searching for it. And she asked him whether he had brought that tea again, the one from the last time, because the girls here only had the orange kind. Sloane stood in the door and could not move. Every week for 14 months he had driven down alone and sat with her and brought tea, and he had never told a living soul, and he had stopped coming the week after Sloane walked out of the drawing room. The near memory was gone. The far one had held on. The Sunday after that, she went down alone. It was late June, and the day room had the windows open onto the parking lot, and somebody's family had brought in a cake for somebody else's birthday, and Sloane sat in the chair beside her mother's chair and talked, the way she talked every week, into the space where an answer used to come from. She told her about the church, and about Father Boland's knee, and about the man who had come to look at the spinet and pronounced it beyond saving. She told her none of the other things. She had never once brought any of the other things into that room, and she was not going to start. And somewhere in the middle of a sentence about nothing at all, Bertie turned her head and looked at her, and her eyes were clear. She said her daughter's name. Not the girl, not the young lady, not the polite address she gave to strangers, she said Sloane. And then she said that she had been watching her carry something all year, and that she wanted her to put it down. And then she said the last of it. And she said it slowly, as though she had gone a long way to fetch it, and did not have much time to hand it over. She said, "Do not pay debts for people who already made their choice." She said, "I made mine." And she said, "Your father made his." Sloane did not move. She was afraid that moving would end it. She sat there with her hand on the arm of the chair and waited. And after a moment her mother's face relaxed by some very small degree, and she turned toward the open window and watched a car back out of a space in the lot. And then she looked back and asked, kindly, whether Sloane was the new one on afternoons, because the last girl had been very good, and she was sorry to see her go. 2 weeks later, Cormac came to the parish hall at St. Brendan's. She had gone back to helping there, not tuning, because she could not tune, but doing the things around a piano that can be done by feel and memory, and he came up the aisle between the folding chairs the way he had come up it once before, in a suit, out of place in every possible way. He was carrying the wooden case. He set it on the closed lid and stepped back from it. The brass latch was the same. The 4 corners were the same, gone soft and round the way they had been since before she was born. And when she got it open, every single thing in it was in its place. The levers and the mutes and the temperament strips, and the 2 French files her father had bought used in a year she had not been alive. And he had gone to a shop on Dorchester Avenue and bought the whole lot back, and had somebody put it in the order she kept it, which meant he had asked somebody, which meant he had thought about it for a long time. She did not thank him. She stood over it with both hands on the edge of the piano and looked into that case for the better part of a minute. Then she asked him the question she had been carrying since November. She said, "That night, when I finished saying all of it, did you ask me one question?" He said no. She said, "That is what did it, not the gate." And he took that the way he took everything, all the way, without flinching, and without offering himself any exit. And then he said the thing she had not prepared for, and could not have prepared for, and he said it looking at the floor. He said he had had her looked into before he asked her to marry him. He said he had known about her father. He had known the amount and the year and the name of the court, and he had known it before the dinner in June, and before the parish hall in September, and he had never once brought it up. She heard herself ask why he had said nothing. He said that it had been hers to tell whenever she wanted to tell it. He said he had been waiting. Sloane put her hand out and took hold of the piano because the floor of that hall had gone unreliable. 8 months. The building. The freezer. Her father's tools on a counter under a loop. A woman in a gray coat in a break room, offering her mother a bed with a window for the rest of her life, and the sound of her own voice saying, "I do not know anything." All of it, every hour of it, spent guarding a door that had been standing open the entire time. The board came back to him in July with everything Rosalind had spent 2 years assembling. The chair, the consolidated holdings, the whole of it cleaned and legal and finally able to stand in daylight, and he turned it down. He did it in one meeting, and it took less than a quarter of an hour. He said he would take the construction arm and the 2 hotels and the property that had come to him directly, which was the part with nothing behind it, and that everything else could go on without him. There were men at that table who had waited 11 years for the family to arrive at exactly this door, and who now watched the only person who could walk them through it decline to touch the handle. He gave up more that afternoon than most of them would earn in their lives, and he did it in the same voice he used to order coffee, and when it was finished, he went out through the front room, where the silver frame now stood upright on the mantel, and his mother was sitting under it. She had been sitting there most of the day. She did not defend herself, and she did not begin with an apology, because she was not a woman who had ever found a use for either, and what she did instead was tell him about his brother. Emmett had been 26. He had married a girl from Charlestown whose people were nobody in particular, and he had done it at the city clerk's office on a Tuesday without telling anyone. And when the family found out, there had been 11 weeks of the kind of pressure that leaves no marks. Then, a man on the other side of a business the family was in had worked out what the girl was worth as a lever, and had taken hold of that lever, and Emmett had gone out one night in February to find her. Rosalind told the rest of it in about 4 sentences, without ornament, the way people describe the worst thing that ever happened to them once they have had 20 years to sand the edges off. She said she had been in the front room when the telephone rang. She said she had been holding a glass of water, and that she had put it down on the mantel, exactly there, and had not picked it up again. And then she said that from that night forward she had understood one thing about the world with perfect clarity, which was that the way you lose a son is through the person he loves, and that she had promised herself in that room that she would not be taught the same lesson twice. She said she had known Sloane Ashby was not dangerous. She said that had never been the point. Cormac listened to the whole of it standing up, with his hand on the back of a chair, and he did not interrupt her once, which was the only mercy either of them had ever been able to give the other. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that he understood why she had done it. He said he was not going to forgive her, and he said that both of those things could live in the same room. Rosalind nodded. She did not argue, and she did not cry, and she looked at the photograph on the mantel instead of at her son, and that was the end of the only conversation the two of them ever had about it. Sloane did not come back that summer. She told him that in the parish hall, in plain language, and without any cruelty in it. And what she said was that for 14 months she had been a woman who lived behind a gate that somebody else controlled, and that she was not going to walk back through it until she was a woman who could stand in front of a locked gate and not need it to open. He understood that better than she expected him to. He did not argue, and he did not offer to buy her anything. He asked for one thing only, which was to be allowed to put it right piece by piece, slowly, in whatever order she wanted, and he said that she could stop it at any point, on any day, without explaining herself to him. She said all right, and that was how it went for a year, slowly, one piece at a time, with the right to stop it sitting in her pocket the entire way like a key she never had to use. A year later, the ground floor of number 41 on Chestnut Street had a small brass plate beside the door that read The Ashby Room, and the lease was in Sloane's name, and it had been drawn up by Gideon Pratt in language so plain that she had read the whole of it herself, in one sitting without needing anybody to explain a word to her. What went on in there was two things at once. Along the north wall were 4 benches where instruments came in that nobody else would take, church uprights and school spinets and pianos that families could not afford to move and could not bear to throw away. And along the south wall, on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, chairs were set out in a circle for people who were caring at home for somebody whose memory was going, and they sat and drank bad coffee, and said out loud the things there is nobody else to say. Her left hand never came back. She had stopped waiting for it somewhere in the previous winter, and had made her peace with it in the way people do, which is by finding out what remains. She could not tune. She could hear, and she could explain, and it turned out she could teach. And by that autumn, there were 6 apprentices working those benches, 3 of them young women who had been told by somebody that there was no living in it. She stood behind them with her hands folded and told them what to listen for. On the stone pillar out front, the keypad was gone, not disabled, not covered over, taken out entirely, and the hole filled with matched granite by a mason who had grumbled about the color for a week. And during opening hours, the gate stood open on its track, and nobody in that house had said a single word about it since. Dermot Quinlan was on the front steps that Saturday morning with his hands in his coat pockets, holding the gate for the children coming up the hill for the 10 o'clock class, and behind him, through the open door, came the sound of the whole thing going. Laughter, a run of wrong notes, a small voice asking loudly what the middle pedal was actually for, and the entire room breaking up over it. There were candy wrappers on the floorboards by noon, and nobody minded. Hollis Vance sat in the corner by the window with a cup of tea and the newspaper folded on his knee, the way he did most weekends now. The brick building on Beacon Street in Somerville had been signed back to him whole, note and title, and 30 years, in a transfer that took one afternoon, and about which the two men had never once had a conversation. Out on the porch, Otis Ward stood at the rail with his telephone in his hand. He looked at it for a while. Then he dialed a number he had known by heart for 20 years, and had never once called, and he listened to it ring, and what happened after that belonged only to him, and all anybody could see from inside was an old man holding onto the porch rail, with his free hand very tightly. Across the street, a black sedan pulled in, and sat at the curb a long time. Rosalind Sheridan got out eventually with something small in her hand, an old brass metronome with the winding key worn smooth, and she walked as far as the painted line at the edge of the property and stopped there. She did not reach for a bell, because there was no bell to reach for anymore. She simply stood on the pavement in her good coat, with her son's metronome held against her chest, and waited, the way a person waits when they have finally understood that they are not owed anything. Sloane saw her through the front window. She wiped her hands on her apron, and she walked out through the hall and down the path, and she opened the gate. That gate had been the strongest thing in that house for 3 generations. But a closed gate has never once proven that anybody was right. All it ever proves is that somebody stopped asking. And the hardest thing a person will ever do is not locking a door against someone who hurt them. It is opening it afterward, when they finally understand that they were the one who got it wrong. If you take one thing from this story, let it be that silence is not always kindness, that protecting someone by keeping them in the dark is still a way of deciding their life for them, and that the single cheapest act of love available to any of us is to ask a question before we pass a sentence. Ask the question. It costs nothing, and it can save everything. If this story moved you, please leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so you can listen to more stories like this one every day. We would truly love to know how this one landed with you, so tell us in the comments what you felt while you were listening, because we read them and they mean a great deal to us. Wishing all of you good health, peace of mind, and quiet joy in your days. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.